tell you, I'm not an expert on the real estate field, and I'm going to talk about taxes and politics, and I want you just to think for the next 15 to 20 minutes about this both as an agent but also as an individual. I hope you have some personal value. And the other thing I will touch on is inflation, because I think it's going to affect everybody in this room, and it relates very much like the stimulus package that they were chatting about and everything else. Government is going to play a much larger role in what you do, at least for the next few years. And how do you react to that? And that's the taxes and politics conversation. Now, I promise I won't touch religion. I get in enough trouble with the first two. Since we're where we are today, we're looking at something that is coming this fall. Does anyone know what the big issue besides the election is going to be? The tax bill, correct. January 1st of next year, the Bush tax cuts by their charter will lapse automatically, and that's all of them. During the last several years, the Bush tax cuts were sort of advertised as a tax cut for the rich, but they're actually a tax cut for everyone. And what I mean by that is the top two brackets, which is President Obama is talking about raising, will generate about $700 billion in additional revenue over the next decade. The remaining under 250 earners will generate about 2.3 trillion. So it's a lot. It was a big tax cut across the entire spectrum. President Obama has stated, and John Boehner, who is not well known, but the minority leader in the House of Representatives, sort of blinked this weekend, that he wants to keep those taxes in place for everyone who makes under 250. And the people who make over 200 individually or 250 as a couple will go back to the 1990s or the Clinton era taxes. You will see a massive fight about this. I suspect it'll affect some of your clients and not others, but this is something that's worth paying attention to, because if you're selling that $1.5 million listing to someone in this environment who will clearly be making $500,000 or more in excess, what is that, and it's not your job, you always want to refer to a CPA, but what is that additional 5%, and it's not 5% more, it's about 15% more, on a monthly basis or an annual basis coming out of their income? Because I know, obviously, you're in the business of selling homes, but you're in the business of selling the right home to the right individual. And these are things that you just want to take into context. As aspects of this tax bill also, the capital gains rate, and I think this is the most relevant to you. The capital gains rate is currently at 15%. It's a historical low. January 1st of next year, it is going to go to 20% with the Bush tax cut left. President Obama has said that's the number that he'd like to take it to. But on January 1st of 2013, the Medicare component of what's called the unearned income tax, which would be capital gains, is an additional 3.8%. Now, why do I mention this? Well, if you have a customer who has a house, and let's say they own a house in Lemon Heights or somewhere in Orange or in Anaheim somewhere, and they bought it a long time ago, have no mortgage, and it's worth $1 million. Now, they're obviously going to get, due to the Tax Relief Act of '97, up to a $500,000 capital gain exemption, but they're going to have a $500,000 tax. If they sell this year, it's $75,000. If they sell next year, it's at 20%. And if they sell in January 1st of 2013, it is an additional income. It's a 60% capital gains tax increase over the next 2.5 years. Now, this should not be your motivation to sell a home or buy a home. But as is talking about adding value, these are the things that you want to make sure that you have in conversations and say, you know, it's important, once again, refer to your financial advisor, your tax accountant, whoever it might be, but just make sure you build this into the repertoire of the decision you're making. Okay, now why are these tax rates going up? What is the reason? Does anyone know? Actually, that's a great point. In case you guys hadn't noticed, we're broke, okay, as a nation. Last year, our budget was $3.5 trillion. Does anyone know what our deficit was last year? $1.4 trillion. Do you know what we brought in tax revenues? $2.1 trillion, obviously. Guess what we spent on Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security? $2.1 trillion. Which means we borrowed defense spending, domestic spending. We actually borrowed the money to pay the interest on the money that we owe. Now that's a neat model. So we have real challenges, and you have two choices. You either can raise revenues or cut spending. Ideally, at some point, have a combination of both. And that's what the real fight you're seeing that's going on right now. Now, we're in a really severe downturn, so the revenues for the government are down more severely than they would be typically. And then we have this massive challenge, which this is, I think, very important for everyone in this room, both individually, but it's a great opportunity as an agent. And I think it's a great opportunity, frankly, as a financial advisor. General Motors, the state of California, and the federal government all have the same problem. Does anyone know what that is? It's not taxes. Well, they certainly spend more, but it's not taxes. It's not the market. It is longevity. When you make agreements with individuals and they live 30 some odd years. And by the way, Social Security, which I think will affect every single person in this room. I see some young people in this room, don't count on it, but if you're 50 and above, it's probably not going to dramatically change. In 1933, this was set up to basically 45 workers pay in, one recipient. That recipient received a check at 64. Does anyone know how long that individual would live?
80.
1 year. What a system. 45 workers pay in, one recipient, that recipient lives a year. Today, if you have a 65-year-old couple, at least one of you is going to live to 91. And ladies, that's you, by the way, just so you know. Well, think about it, though. That provides a real challenge as an agent to save for retirement, as an agent who deals with their customers. Your customers, you get a customer who's 35 or 40 today, there's a very good chance that you could have that customer for 40 years. And you could buy, you use the example of several homes. And it doesn't have to be an incredibly affluent person. I have 3 small children. I bought a house in Tustin. I moved to South Orange County. I may someday want to buy a house at the beach. I may ultimately want to move to the beach. And these are transactions that you can have throughout your lifetime. But that challenge of longevity is both a blessing and a curse. And that's really what's driving everything that you're hearing in Washington. Because every 8 seconds for the next 30 years, someone turns 60. And that's going to have Medicare costs, Social Security costs, entitlement costs. One thing on Social Security, just as a personal value add, they are going to fix Social Security. They're going to make 3 changes. They're going to change the age. Okay, now, I won't get into it at length, but the reality is if we're living longer, most people are going to get Social Security later. They're going to raise the taxes. Currently, you pay on your first $100,000, and I would suspect there are many agents in this room, and in 05 and 06 and 07 who had very good years, and you had that moment where you had more income because you weren't getting as much FICO taken out. That is going to be raised from roughly 100,000 probably to 200,000. And the third thing they're going to do is means testing. And this is an important one just for your clients. What is means testing? Means testing is if you are of means, you get less Social Security. And they already did this, by the way. They did it in the 80s. They put an income tax on Social Security. What's an income tax? It's a means test. But they're trying to drive more and more of these programs to needier people, and people who are more affluent are going to be responsible to handle themselves. Now, they're going to give you tools, Roth IRAs and other tools like that, but you as an individual have to think about this and say, look, none of us go out to not be successful. We want to make sure that we earn as much, but there's an old adage, if you remember from your childhood, which it's not what you make, it's what you or keep, okay? Now, hasn't mattered for a long time, because from 1982 to 2000, the market went up 14% a year. The real estate market in California, you guys could quote all the time. In fact, I'm very proud of this. I went to Arizona State University, and I did a speech at Harvard once, and then this was in 2005. I got 12 minutes into the speech, and I realized that every single person in this room thought that real estate never went down and inflation was 2.5%, because that's what their perspective was. And really, from 2001 through January 1st of next year, we had a pretty benign tax environment. What I'm saying to you as an individual, as an agent, looking at it, saying, how do I negotiate a market going forward that will have higher taxes, I'm going to live longer, my clients are going to live longer, which means I have to save more. And then ultimately, how do I keep as much of what I make? And you probably have more flexibility because I suspect you might be 1099. Everyone 1099?
Less than W2.
Okay, so you have a little more flexibility than, say, someone like me who's W2'd. There's a joke, we call it getting check jacked. Every 2 weeks, they just take it out of your check, and then you negotiate some money back in April. But you have to think about that, both, as I said, as an agent and individual, how does this affect me? Okay, and then how is government going to help me or hurt me going forward? We all may have our personal views. And I do hope you find that this information is meant to be agnostic. I always admit during my presentations that I'm a Northeast conservative, which means 2 things. I'm extinct, and nobody likes what I have to say. You know, I've got this mother-in-law in Orange County who's slightly right of Attila the Hun politically, and she thinks I'm liberal. And my parents are from Boston and high school teachers, and they think I'm overly conservative. So, but if you look at it, think about the information and how it affects me. Now let's talk about inflation for a second. Is everyone interested in that?
Yeah.
Okay. As we stand here today, there is no inflation, okay? There is a boogeyman on every single news channel telling you that it's around the corner tomorrow. I, by the way, make a recommendation. Turn your TV off, preview a house. Because you do not get information from CNN, MSNBC, Fox, or CNBC. They give you affirmation. This is how I think. I want someone to reinforce it, okay? The reality is we don't know when inflation's coming. I can't answer that question. I do know that it's a ways off. And how do I know that with great conviction? Well, right now the unemployment rate is almost 10%. The biggest contributor to inflation is wages. Who here feels they can, at the end of the meeting, go to Jennifer and say, I'm doing a great job, I want a 20% raise? Right? Feel free to ask. I don't think it's going to work. And it isn't working at any other business across the country. So you have no wage expansion. The second is credit expansion. Does everyone in here have a nightmare story over the last 6 months of dealing with a bank? Right? It's been very hard to get money, very different than it was 4 or 5 years ago. The third is, and this is the most easy to relate to, is perception. Who here has shopped at Best Buy? Anyone shopped at Best Buy?
Sure.
The land of discretionary items. Nothing you need, everything you want. Okay? Why, over the last year and a half, was the #1 reason given why people walked out? And you're probably facing this, by the way, as agents. It's not the color. It's not financing. It's not the rude salesperson, although I do alarmingly get that a lot. The #1 reason given was, I think it'll be cheaper in 6 months. And I suspect you're probably getting that in the real estate market. There was no perception of inflation. If I were doing this presentation in 1975, I'd have a big lapel and a brown suit on in all likelihood. But I'd say if you were done and you wanted to buy a car at the end of this meeting, you go to the Ford dealership. You know what the salesman's pitch was? Better buy it today. It'll be $300 more next year. And you believed him, because that was a perception of inflation. We haven't gotten there yet, okay? Now, why am I giving you this information yet talking about inflation? Because I can tell you with great conviction inflation's coming. Why? Ben Bernanke is in control of the Fed. He is from MIT. He is a student of the Great Depression. He is also a student of what Japan did wrong over the last 20 years. And we're not Japan, just so everyone knows. There's about a 5% chance we replicate. We have a very dynamic economy. It's not related. We're growing as a population. But Ben Bernanke wants to avoid deflation at all costs, which is that, honey, let's go buy a fridge or a house. Maybe we'll wait till next year. It'll be 10% cheaper, and it is. And then the next year, and the next year, and the next year. It's this chronic deflation. He's going to avoid it at all costs. He's going to use every tool in his arsenal. So he's going to print money in the basement of the Fed. He is going to buy short-term treasuries. He's going to buy mortgages. He's going to do everything he can to create inflation. Now, the consequence of that is inflation. I'm 40 years old. I bought a house in South Orange County in 2005. I frankly could use some inflation, because reasonable inflation is very good for real estate. So that's